Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Kinda Murdery, a true crime podcast that's mostly about murder, and always about the strange and compelling stories that arise when the path less traveled twists to darkness, and those who walk its shadows surrender to violence and moral corruption. We have a perilous journey ahead, so thank you for lending me your courage and good company. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. Hello everyone. I hope you're having a lovely Sunday evening, Monday morning, or whenever you happen to catch this episode. Thank you for deciding to spend some of your precious time with me. You've found your way to Part 2, the thrilling conclusion of Unholy Trinity, the serial killing trio behind the Ohio River pirate treasure. That's right, I said Part 2, so if you haven't heard Part 1 yet, go back and listen to it. I'll save you a seat. If you're all caught up, well then let's jump right into it. I see no reason to fiddle fart around. Today, you get to hear about the possible location of the hidden pirate treasure, the mysterious death of Samuel Mason, the predictable death of wily little Harp, and legends of witches and ghosts surrounding this whole story that we're in the middle of. As I often do with these multi-part stories, I'm going to rewind the narrative just a bit to allow you to settle comfortably in. And now, if you're ready, please join me as together we uncover what truths we can and solve what mysteries we may. Kinda Murdery's Unholy Trinity, the serial killing trio behind the Ohio River pirate treasure. Part 2, the thrilling conclusion, starts now. Mason feared attacks by the Native American allies of the British. On August 31st, 1777, he was proven correct when a band of Native Americans from several eastern tribes attacked the fort. Initially, they fired on several men who were outside the fort rounding up horses. When Mason heard the shots, he gathered 14 militiamen and rode to their rescue. This, however, was exactly what the warriors had hoped for and quickly ambushed the rescue party, killing every last man except for Captain Samuel Mason. The captain, however, was severely wounded and escaped death by hiding behind a log. He was soon rescued and recovered from his wounds to command Fort Henry for 2 more years. In 1779, he moved to Washington County, Pennsylvania, where he bought a 500-acre farm. In July of 1781, he was elected Justice of the Peace and was named an associate judge just a few months later. In 1782, Mason appeared to be successful, as he paid taxes on his 500-acre farm, 2 horses, 4 cows, 6 sheep, and 4 slaves. So what happened to cause American revolutionary, Fort Henry captain, gentleman farmer, justice of the peace, and judge a series of descriptions that could not possibly be more upstanding law and order pillar of the community? What happened to cause Samuel Mason to become a notorious serial murdering river pirate? Where the heck did he hide all that gold treasure? And how exactly, beyond occasionally harboring them at Cave in the Rock, does his story intersect with those bloodthirsty pieces of human garbage, the Harps? Never fear, we'll be answering all those questions here today, starting with, how did such a pillar of the community wind up becoming a river pirate? What the heck happened? The answer is debt. Debt happened. Mason was struggling financially, and he became deeply indebted. After having been repeatedly accused of being a thief, he made his way from Pennsylvania to Kentucky in 1784. His Pennsylvania farm was sold at a sheriff's sale to pay for part of his debt the following year. In 1789, the Pennsylvania court sent a man to Kentucky to collect the remaining debt, but that man was unsuccessful. By the early 1790s, Mason was settled at Red Banks, now known as Henderson, Kentucky. Later, he moved downriver to Diamond Island, where he began to engage in criminal activity. By 1797, he moved his headquarters further down to Cave in the Rock on the Illinois shore. By this time, he had gathered several followers who openly based themselves at Cave in the Rock. Here, Mason and his men would warmly welcome riverboat travelers to rest and eat. However, while these visitors enjoyed their hospitality, Mason's men checked the visitors' supplies and goods for anything of value. If they found something, they'd wait until the next day, and, when the visitors continued down the river, they'd rob them as they made their way around the bend. As I previously mentioned, while at Cave in the Rock, Mason and his men briefly harbored the notorious Harp brothers, who were perpetually on the run from the law. We've already discussed at length the various horrifying ways in which the Harps were two of the most brutal outlaws of the time, and they distinguished themselves as America's first serial killers. While as for the Mason gang, although they could be ruthless, even they were appalled by the actions of the Harps, especially when the two psychotic cousin brothers began to make a habit of taking travelers to the top of the bluff above Cave Rock, stripping the travelers naked, and throwing them off the bluff. This was the last straw for Mason, who asked the brothers to leave. In the summer of 1799, the Mason gang itself was forced to leave Cave in the Rock when they were attacked by a group called the Exterminators. Sounds like a Sylvester Stallone movie, which in some ways is not terribly far off. The Exterminators were a group of vigilante bounty hunters led by Captain Young of Mercer County, Kentucky. In response to repeated attacks by the Exterminators, Mason moved his operations downriver and settled his family in Spanish Louisiana. Mason and his men became highwaymen on the Natchez Trace Trail in Mississippi, robbing and killing unsuspecting travelers. You've likely deduced this by now, but the trio of serial killers in the title of this episode were the Harp brothers and Mason himself, who, during his career as an outlaw, was credited with 20 or more murders, mostly of unsuspecting travelers that he and his gang robbed. Now, I know there may be an impulse to refer to someone like that more as a bandit than a serial killer. However, Mason did have a consistent MO, a consistent target profile, and essentially all the other requirements to refer to his repeated murders as serial killings. Even if he was ostensibly killing for personal enrichment, he was killing over and over the same type of person in the same manner, which made him America's third, I suppose, or second serial killer. If the Harps were America's first serial killers, 1, 2, 3, that makes Mason number 3. Alright, so there he is with his gang on the Natchez Trail in Mississippi, robbing and killing unsuspecting travelers, when, in April of 1802, Mississippi Governor William C.C. Claiborne was informed that Samuel Mason and Wiley Harp had attempted to board the boat of Colonel Joshua Baker between Yazoo and Walnut Hills, now Vicksburg, Mississippi. The governor responded by ordering Colonel Daniel Burnett with 15 or 20 volunteers to track down Mason and his men. A reward of $2,000 was offered for their capture. This was a heftier sum than it perhaps sounds like at first, as $2,000 in 1802 is roughly equivalent to $49,000 today. Although dozens of men searched for the Mason gang, the outlaws continued with their evil deeds along the Natchez Trace. They struck a caravan of travelers with such horrific brutality that, in response, another posse of residents and a few bounty hunters were raised to go after them. The posse quickly pursued, learning that Mason and his men were hiding less than a mile west of the trace near Rocky Springs, Mississippi. When they came upon the Mason gang's camp, they found that it had been hastily abandoned. Though the outlaws' trail was fresh, most of the posse chose not to follow, instead remaining at the camp, searching for any hidden loot that the outlaws may have left. However, a few men did continue pursuit, but ultimately abandoned the search when they lost the gang's trail. Later, Spanish officials were more successful. In January 1803, they arrested Mason, 4 of his sons, and several other men at the Little Prairie Settlement, now Caruthersville in southeastern Missouri. Mason and his family members were taken to the colonial government in New Madrid, Missouri, where a 3-day hearing was held to determine whether Mason was a pirate. Although Mason claimed that he was simply a farmer who had been maligned by his enemies, the presence of $7,000 in currency and 20 human scalps in his baggage, see, serial killer, convinced the Spanish he was guilty. Mason, his family, and the other men then boarded a boat to New Orleans, where they would be handed over to the American governor in Mississippi Territory. So to clarify, they were captured in a part of Missouri that was Spanish territory at the time, and then they were to be transported via boat to Mississippi to be handed over to American authorities. Side note, if it were up to me, I'm not sure I would put the nation's most notorious river pirate on a boat when I was transporting him as a prisoner, but hey, it wasn't up to me. So they got on a boat in New Orleans, and they were supposed to be handed over to the American governor in the Mississippi Territory. However, in one of the least surprising developments of this story, while being transported, Mason and Wiley Harp, Wiley being Little Harp, who at this point had rejoined the Mason gang and was a member of the gang using the alias John Sutton, well, Mason and Wiley overpowered their guards and fled. And although Mason was shot in the leg, he made good his escape. His escape from the authorities, that is. More on that in a moment. When Mason escaped, Governor William C.C. Claiborne immediately added an additional $500 reward for his recapture, making the total reward $2,500, or close to $62,000 today. This was an absolutely staggering amount of money, and it prompted Wiley Harp, aka Little Harp, aka John Sutton, current member of the Mason gang, along with another man, to attempt to bring in Mason's head and claim the reward in September 1803. So there you go. Good reasons not to harbor the Harps or be friends with the Harps. They're happy to kill you for the reward money. Many historians believe that Samuel Wolfman Mason was, in fact, yet another victim of Wiley Harp. So there you go. That's the connection, besides hanging out and robbing together, between the Harps and Mason. The Harps, well, one of them, Wiley, actually killed Samuel Mason, the runner-up for America's earliest serial killers. But other historians assert that Mason actually died from the leg wound he received when he was shot escaping the authorities alongside Harp. And the question of how exactly Samuel Mason died has never been definitively settled. He was either murdered by Wiley Harp in an attempt to retrieve the reward money, or he died from an infected leg wound when escaping with Wiley Harp. So one way or another, in a certain sense anyway, Wiley Harp had something to do with Mason's death. So anyhow, when Mason died, Wiley and the other man cut off his head and brought it into the authorities and tried to collect that whopping $2,500 reward. However, cunning, cruelty, and a penchant for violence doesn't necessarily correlate directly with intelligence. And as you may have suspected, and as Wiley and his partner should have suspected, they were both recognized by the authorities. I mean, after all, Wiley was one of the most notorious killers of the time. He was recognized by the authorities, arrested, tried in federal court, found guilty of piracy, and hanged in Greenville, Mississippi in early 1804. There would be no bounty money for Wiley Harp. His only reward for killing and beheading and delivering the head of notorious river pirate Samuel Wolfman Mason was a quick and much-deserved death at the end of a rope. And so, the ultimate fate of American founding serial killer fathers Micajah Big Harp, Wiley Little Harp, and Samuel Wolfman Mason, notorious river pirate, had been decided. As you'll likely recall with a shiver, Micajah died when he was beheaded by posse member Moses Stegall in 1799. Stegall, who was avenging the murder of his infant son, killed by the Harps for the grievous sin of refusing to stop crying. This was an infant. As for Samuel Wolfman Mason, he was beheaded by Little Harp. He either died from the infected leg wound that resulted from the gunshot he received while escaping from the Spanish riverboat in 1803, and was then beheaded by Wiley Little Harp because Harp wanted to collect the massive reward, or he was killed by Harp and then beheaded. But whether he died from the infected gunshot wound or by Harp's hand, I tend to think it was the latter. Either way, he was definitely beheaded by Wiley Harp. And again, that's the connection, besides doing crimes together, between Mason and the Harps. He was the serial killer victim of the serial killing Harps, a la Dexter. And then, of course, Wiley Harp was hanged for river piracy in 1804. So although Mason was the river pirate and the Harps were just serial killing monster outlaws, it was Wiley Harp who was hanged for river piracy and Mason who was killed by the Harps, etc., etc. You get it. It's just all a little jumbled. Not quite the outcome one might expect. Now, we've covered the lives, crimes, and deaths of the serial killing trio, the Unholy Trinity, if you will. But we've got a couple more important things, promised things to cover. 1, what became of that Ohio River pirate treasure? 2, what about that witch that I teased you with in the show notes and at the beginning of the last episode? And then, in case you're curious, because I know I am, what about the Harp brothers' 3 wives? Big Harp's 2 wives and Wiley's wife, the women that they outraged and forced to become their wives, or at least fill the role of their wives. What about their story? What became of them? Well, it's time to cover all of that, starting with the pirate treasure. Cave in the Rock, where the Mason gang had their headquarters, is on the northern bank of the Ohio River, right by the Illinois-Kentucky border, a couple miles south of a place called Love's Corner. It is now a state park in Hardin County, Illinois. Cave in the Rock had been used for thousands of years by Native Americans, but is known better in Anglo history for the many outlaws it harbored. In addition to the Mason gang and the Harp brothers, other famous outlaws known to have hidden out at Cave in the Rock were highwaymen James Ford and Isaiah Potts, several counterfeiters, and the post-Civil War bandit Logan Belt, as well as others. In this 55-foot wide cave, which leads a short distance into the bluff, it's said that over $1 million worth of stolen loot, gold, cash, and counterfeit bills changed hands between 1790 and 1830 alone. In 1800, the Mason gang was rumored to have hidden a large stash of gold in Cave in the Rock, but Mason was killed before retrieving it. In addition to the gold allegedly hidden by Mason, more caches of gold and silver are said to be hidden along the cliff face. Now, if the hidden treasure itself isn't enough of a legend, Cave in the Rock is also said to be haunted, but that's another story. Let's stick with the pirate treasure here. The most persistent legend is that it's hidden somewhere in Cave in the Rock, but there's another legend that says that Mason's cache is hidden near Rocky Springs, Mississippi, the area where Samuel Mason and Wiley Harp had their hideout while raiding the Natchez Trail in the early 1800s. After having made a large robbery on the trace, they returned to their campsite. This is Mason and Harp, and although they often carried their stolen loot on the backs of a couple mules, they knew at the time that they were being aggressively pursued by law enforcement. So this time they decided to bury their cash near the camp and retrieve it later. However, neither Samuel Mason nor Wiley Harp would be able to retrieve the treasure because, as you know, they would both be dead. Mason killed by Harp, Harp hanged for showing up with Mason's head and trying to collect the reward. According to this legend, there's said to be some $75,000 in stolen gold and silver coins buried somewhere between the old church and the cemetery of Little Sand Creek. However, it would be hard to look for today as the land is either privately owned or belongs to the National Park Service. There's another tale that Samuel Mason buried a very large chest, a chest that was some 7 feet long. He buried it 4 miles northwest of Roxy, Mississippi, and the chest is supposed to be full of stolen valuables, including gold coins and jewelry, which was allegedly buried near an artesian well on the Reber Dove farm. If the story's true, this cache has never been found. Yet more tales say that Mason loot was hidden at Stack Island, Mississippi, also at the ghost town of Tillman, Mississippi in Claiborne County, and that there's as much as $250,000 somewhere near one of the gang's favorite drinking spots, the Colbert Tavern and Inn on the Natchez Trace near Bissell, Mississippi. So, if you want to go treasure hunting, you've got yourself multiple starting points. Just make sure you don't break any laws or get attacked by any angry landowners or other treasure hunters while you're at it. I'd hate to fear for your safety. Alright, now it's time to find out what happened to the harp's wives, and what, if anything, that has to do with both witches and ghosts. On the day Big Harp was killed in August 1799, the harp's wives were left at the camp. The 3 women, each having 1 child, were taken to Henderson and placed in an empty blockhouse. On September 4th, all 3 were charged with being parties to the murders of Mary Stiegel, her infant son James, and Captain William Love. They were bound for trial in Russellville, but were tried and released in October. Thank goodness. It seems so unfair to treat those women who had been essentially kidnapped and repeatedly raped as accomplices. Sally Rice Harp returned to Knoxville to be with her father. She later married a highly respected man and raised a large family. Susan Wood stayed in the Russellville area where she lived a respectable life and died in Tennessee. As for Maria Davidson, by then going by the alias of Betsy Roberts, she married a man named John Huffstutler in September of 1803. By 1828, they'd moved to Hamilton County, Illinois, where they raised a large family and lived until they died in the 1860s. The Harps' wives were not the only ones who changed their names following all the atrocities committed by the Harps. In fact, many of the Harp family members changed their names so as not to be connected to the heinous violent murderers. So I know that's not a lot of detail, but essentially, at least to some extent, the Harps' 3 wives seem to have lived more or less happily ever after. So, something small to be thankful for there. Now, what about the witches? What about the ghost? What's going on with that, right? Well, with the violence surrounding the vicious Harps, it's really no surprise that a ghostly legend is attached to them. In particular, the notorious Micajah Big Harp, who I'm sure you'll recall was beheaded by Stiegel, avenging his infant son and wife. So in addition to terrorizing the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Illinois, the Harps were often known, and we've talked about this, to have traveled along the Natchez Trace Trail through Mississippi. Now, between Tupelo and Houston, Mississippi, yes, there's a Houston, Mississippi, there's a place called Witch Dance. Now, Witch Dance has been steeped in mystery for centuries. It was not only the home of the mound builders of Mississippi, but it's also said to have been used by a coven of witches who would gather for nighttime ceremonies. Lore has it that wherever the witches' feet touched the ground during their dances, the grass would wither and die, never to grow again. At some point before his death, Micajah Big Harp was traveling along the Natchez Trace with a Native American guide who showed him the bare spots on the ground and told him the legend of the witch dance. Big Harp only scoffed at this and began to leap from spot to spot, daring the witches to come out and fight him. Of course, nothing happened, at least not then. Eventually, Big Harp returned to Kentucky, where the posse tracked him down in August 1799. After he was decapitated and his head placed in a tree, the skull was said to have been removed by a witch, ground into powder, and used as a potion to heal a relative. Word soon got around, and when travelers retold the story along the trace, they would swear they could hear cackling laughter from nearby bushes and trees. So the revenge of the witches for the disrespect of Micajah Harp was to steal the head from his corpse and grind it into a potion. And to this day, if you walk through Witch Dance on the Natchez Trail, you can hear the ghosts of those witches cackling, pleased to have exacted their revenge on Micajah Harp. I, for one, would like to personally thank those witches, and with any luck, they are still tormenting the souls of both Micajah and Wiley. Side note, Micajah Harp's head was actually taken twice. First, it was taken by Stiegel in vengeance, and then it was taken by witches who ground it up into a healing potion. I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.